Hi, my name is Kent Piquel. I am President and CEO of Search Institute, and this is a re-recording of a webinar that I did earlier today with more than 1,000 people from schools and youth programs and out-of-school time organizations, where I shared some really exciting new data that has come from a just concluded Search Institute study. Unfortunately, the technology in the webinar didn't go as well as the study because it was sort of Armageddon from the outset, and videos didn't work and my voice didn't work, and I literally got kicked out while 1,000 people were waiting to hear about the data, and people were incredibly kind and patient. And so this re-recording is to revisit the themes that were in the presentation, some of which nobody ever saw, and that hopefully will go far better this time around. So if you are rejoining us from having been involved in my misadventure this morning with the webinar technology, thank you for coming back. And if you're seeing this for the first time, it is great to have you here to give you a quick overview of what we're learning about developmental relationships, equity, and social emotional learning and the connections between them. So I am now going to take a moment to share my screen and jump in to the beginning of our conversation. And so we are getting ready to go live. The trifecta, developmental relationships, equitable environments, and social emotional learning are the three things young people need right now. The first thing we did in the webinar this morning was actually, or it was actually at noon this afternoon, was just find out a quick sense of who was there in that 1,000 people who joined us for the conversation. And so we asked if they were from a school, an out-of-school time program, or an organization that works during the school day, but is not directly a part of the school or district, an organization potentially like communities and schools or city or some other kind of organization. And we invited people to share their responses to that in the box later on. Here's what we found. I'm going to be able after the fact to let you know what those 1,000 people told us in the polls that we ran during the webinar. 20% of them were people who are school staff, 13% work in out of school time, about a third of them work in an organization that supports students in schools, and another third worked in some other type of organization. It really was a pretty extraordinary array of organizations that joined us for the conversation. Some work in child welfare, some worked in juvenile justice, some worked in community coalitions, some worked in prevention. So a really great collection of people, all of whom are really, really committed to and interested in understanding relationships and the connections between equity and SEL. The next thing I did in the webinar, and I would invite you if you're playing along at home watching this recording, is to think back to the years that the participants were growing up when they were young, and to think about who showed them that they really mattered to them, who pushed them to keep getting better, who helped them keep on task and achieve their goals when they were trying to do things during their years as a child or as a teenager, who treated them with respect and gave them a say in making decisions, and who connected them with people, places, ideas that broadened their world. And I invited people to write a name of someone who did those things in the chat box. And well, I couldn't see it at the time because the technology wasn't working on that webinar. After the fact, I got to see it was really an extraordinary array of people, from teachers to mentors to, of course, parents, family members, all of whom did some of those things that are listed there on the slide. And then that was a segue, intended to be a segue into the debut of a short video that we've recently put together at Search Institute that summarizes some of the findings of a major project that ended this summer that we did in partnership with 5 youth-serving organizations. The video didn't work then, but it's going to work now. And the goal is to connect those people that we just talked about and thought about on the last slide to some of the themes that are emerging through our work and our research at Search Institute. So here is the semi-debut of They Shape Who You Are.
We just have to help every single person out, because at the end of the day, every person counts, and you just gotta show them that there is hope.
What we have noticed is one of the missing factors in the wider community is that healthy web of adult relationships surrounding every child.
We have found that there's a certain group of kids that are just like relationship magnets. They've got like 5 or more developmental relationships with adults in their lives. And then most kids fall somewhere below that, but then in sample after sample, we find about 1 in 5 kids really tell us with a lot of clarity that I don't have anyone in my life who regularly expresses care, challenges growth, provides support, shares power, and expand possibility. And when we think about that, we think about how important these relationships are to kids' development. That gap, what we might call the relationship gap with that 1 in 5 kids who are saying, I don't have it, should give us all a lot of pause.
They are less likely to perform at their highest level when they don't believe that they have someone who cares for them, who understands them. So City Year is really starting to fill in those gaps.
For a lot of my students, they face instability within their relationships with adults every single day. They deal with heartbreak, they deal with disappointment from adults. It's really crucial that when they come into a school building, they have that unwavering love, sometimes stern, high expectations, and that balance of friendship, but also that kind of, we're friends, but I also have to set these expectations for you. And our core members do that every single day.
Developmental relationships are key to a healthy, functioning society and democracy. Society depends upon the collaboration of folks in neighborhoods working together to solve community problems. That can't happen without the presence of developmental relationships.
Relationships in kids' lives are like roots. They're like the roots of a tree. If the roots are strong, then those kids can grow, they can thrive in really powerful ways. The roots are influenced by the soil in which they're growing and the air in which they're growing. If that soil is rich, then the roots are going to be stronger, then the growth is going to be better.
The ability to intentionally help young people develop strong relationships with adults and their peers is singularly important to the way that we do our work.
I don't think you should ever force a relationship, but I think having City Year intentionally work and build those relationships with the kids, I think definitely has made a change. I think the City Year and the students' relationship has definitely grown. And I think because they are having better, more intentional relationships with the students, I think our students are gonna be more successful because of that.
Absolutely. When we talk about the multiple dimensions of relationships, it's care, it's challenging growth, it's expanding possibilities, it's sharing power, that we see our young people empowered. We see them be able to address conflict more effectively. They feel more confident in their ability to discuss things that are challenging to them, that are hurting them, that don't feel right to them.
I'd say it's helped me connect with students in a way that I probably wouldn't have otherwise. You know, I like to connect with all my students anyway, but this program gave me a structure where I had to really ask them questions I might not have asked otherwise, like, how do you feel about your relationships with your peers or with me as your teacher? It also forced me to be honest with myself about how I was doing building relationships and how I was fostering relationships between students.
He kind of connected with the students more than any other teacher, I'd say. He cares about what we think, he cares about our opinions. He makes sure that we understand what we're learning.
When I first entered the classroom, I looked at it, I said, it's gonna be a good class. I already know my expectations. He's gonna ask me for work and stuff. When I first met Mr. Turner is an awesome teacher, introduced himself, and that's the kind of teacher I want to get ready to go to school for.
Ms. Brown really did help me with the 5 steps for the developmental relationships. It's because I developed a relationship with her and she developed one with me. We have a good relationship where we respect one another along with anyone else outside of CS. That really shapes us who we are as students and as we go on through our life.
So a quick sense there of some of the work that has emerged through our relationships, through the research that we're doing on developmental relationships. And as I outlined in the video, or as my colleagues and I outlined in the video, the first and most critical of those 5 elements of a developmental relationship that has emerged through the research we've done at Search Institute is expressing care. That's no surprise. The old saying that people don't care what you know until they know that you care is emphatically being proved true in our research. But critically, when we think about relationships in kids' lives, we often think of caring or a caring adult. But if the goal is to have a developmental relationship, one that is propulsive for a kid, one that takes them from here to there and through which they develop things like a positive identity and agency, then caring is necessary but not sufficient. And equally importantly, is the second element of a developmental relationship is challenging growth. And then that builds into providing active support as the third element. Sharing power is the fourth, and the fifth and final is expanding possibilities. And let me just give you, especially for those of you who are not familiar with the developmental relationships framework, a quick overview of each of those 5 elements, because the data that I'm going to show you in the rest of our session here today really requires a fairly firm understanding of what those 5 key building blocks of a developmental relationship are in the work that we're doing. On the side of the screen, you're going to see a quote that comes directly from the qualitative research that we have done, which we do with youth in schools, in families, in community settings, in out-of-school time program settings. And then I'm going to show you what we put into the measurement of each of those 5 elements of the developmental relationship. So the key critical idea behind expressing care is mattering. It's that young person feels that they really matter to the teacher, to the group leader in an out-of-school time program, maybe to the probation officer, to the foster parent, to the counselor, whoever that adult is. The sense that if I didn't come back here tomorrow, you would miss me. And when we conceptualize and measure expressing care, it's a dynamic combination of 5 key actions: being dependable for kids, listening to kids, believing in them, being warm, including non-verbally with kids, and then encouraging them for their efforts and for their achievements. So that's a quick snapshot of expressing care. Building into the second element in the framework, challenging growth. The key idea there is to push kids to keep getting better. In some ways, thinking about challenging growth in a developmental relationship, a good metaphor is our best athletics coaches. Of course, they're going to be working with the player on the team who's struggling, who can't quite master a skill. But that doesn't mean they're going to be saying to the best player on the team, you're good, just hang out, you're fine, you don't need to do better. Even that person is going to be given advice and is going to be pushed to get better. There's always that propulsive quality to a developmental relationship. And in challenging growth, we see 4 actions as especially critical: high expectations, stretching beyond their comfort zone, holding kids accountable, and helping them reflect on and make meaning from their mistakes and failures. So that's the second element of the developmental relationships framework. The third is providing support. And there, the key idea is helping young people complete tasks and achieve their goals. In a lot of settings that we've examined, we see kids at one or the other extreme. Either they're left to figure stuff out entirely on their own, or sometimes, especially with what we often call helicopter parents, people basically do the work for them. And developmental support really is what we call scaffolded. You're like that guide on the side. You're providing support, but you're not doing it for them or leaving them to struggle on their own. And so providing support is a combination of helping kids navigate challenging circumstances, situations, empowering them to find their own solutions, advocating for them when they need it, and also setting boundaries, putting limits on them. Now, sometimes people ask us, why is setting boundaries a kind of support? That feels sort of negative and punitive, and support is supposed to be positive and helpful. And it's there because when we went out and did the original research behind the framework, with striking frequency, the kids, when we asked them, who are the adults in your life who make you better? With striking frequency, they mentioned people who had cared about them and also placed limits on them. So I know that the next time you set a boundary for a young person, whether it's your own child or somebody you work with in a school or program, especially if they're a teenager, they're rarely going to look you in the eyes and say, thank you for that developmentally beneficial boundary in my life. But remember, when we went and we asked kids, not at the moment of having the boundary set for them or the consequence imposed on them, but at a moment when they had some opportunity for reflection and thought, they really did see the people who placed appropriate boundaries on them, but who did so with real caring as powerful, positive influences in their lives. That brings us to the fourth element of the developmental relationship framework, sharing power. And the key idea there is treating young people with respect and giving them a say. Now, sharing power doesn't mean relinquishing power. You're still the parent, you're still the teacher, you're still the group leader in a program, but it does mean giving kids voice and choice in ways that are appropriate to their ages and their stages. That's a mix of kids feeling respected, included, collaborated with, and especially letting them lead in opportunity in ways that are meaningful, but also reflective the scenarios in which they're there. So for instance, giving kids, if you were a teacher, as I was at one point, multiple choices to do an assignment is a powerful way of sharing power. You're still shaping the content, the assignment they need to do, but you're giving them choices between one way of meeting your expectations, or another way, or potentially even a third. That brings us to our fifth and final element of the framework, which is expanding possibilities. It's connecting kids with people, places, ideas that broaden their worlds. And that's a mix of inspiring kids, especially by example. You know, the old saying of they pay attention to what we do, not what we say, very much coming through in our work. Broadening their horizons by exposing them to new ideas, new experiences, new places, and then especially connecting them to people who can help them grow and learn and change. So our research to date has shown that when kids experience relationships with adults that are characterized by high levels of those 5 elements, their social emotional competencies are higher in very significant ways. This chart is a graph of a data set with 25,000 middle and high school students, and you can see there for every one of these developmental relationships they have in their lives, they're more likely to be caring, responsible, have strong social emotional skills, and make better decisions. Other studies have shown, for instance, that when kids experience developmental relationships with their teachers, it powerfully and positively influences their motivation to learn in school, which in turn influences the very important educational outcome of grades as measured by GPA. So we can see here that developmental relationships themselves alone don't translate into, for instance, a positive academic outcome in school, but that the developmental relationships activate the students' internal motivation to work hard, to try things, to fail, to get back up again, which in turn translates into an improved academic outcome. So here we can see relationships are necessary, they're not sufficient. The kid has to take what they get from the relationship and put it into practice, put it into action. And that's what leads to positive youth development. So that's a wildly quick overview of our research to date. What I am really excited to share is some new data that has come from a recent fairly large data set that we've gathered across the United States. It is not a representative sample of the country, but as you'll see in a moment, it's a diverse sample. And so it gives us a real opportunity to dig into some of the implications of relationships. My colleagues and I at Search Institute in the future will certainly be doing further analysis and research on this data set, and we'll be submitting, as we always do, articles to peer-reviewed journals for publication. But as an applied research organization that is really, really committed to practice, we don't want to restrict our sharing of the insights that come through our research to peer-reviewed journals and other researchers. And so that's why we are undertaking stuff like the webinar I tried to do earlier today and the updated video you're watching, which is really kind of an early update on what we're learning, even as we're just beginning to do the data analysis. So you might call these early findings that we will continue to build upon in the weeks and months ahead. The instrument through which we collected the data is a new survey. It's a new survey that actually is now available to the field from Search Institute. It has the catchy name of the Developmental Relationships Survey. And in this case, the data that I'm now going to share with you came from 4,000 young people in grades 4 through 12 who participated in the pilot, year-long pilot of this survey. 80% of those young people were surveyed in schools, 13 in after-school and other out-of-school time programs, and 7% in supports programs that support students in schools, like communities in schools, as I mentioned earlier. The sample was fairly balanced between middle and high school, with a significant number, but still a much smaller number at the elementary grades. That's in part because, frankly, it's hard for little kids to take surveys. And so those were the older elementary grades, 4th grade and up, and a smaller sample. And that's harder partly for reasons of reading level, and partly just for, you know, some of the social emotional competencies that are required to sit and answer a bunch of questions in a survey, which we know develop over time. The sample is about half male and about half female, and you can see there it is a diverse sample racially and culturally, though predominantly white in this instance, and 18% of the kids identified as Latinx in this survey. There's more information on the Developmental Relationship Survey on the Search Institute website. You can see the address there if you want to actually access that site to learn about the survey, and my colleagues and I at Search are always glad to answer questions about it. Candidly, this is not a commercial for the survey, but part of, as a mission-driven nonprofit devoted to positive youth development and equity, part of the way we meet our mission is to take the resources that emerge from our research and make them available to the field. And we do that not just with surveys and measurement, but with professional development, youth activities, family engagement resources for organizational change, research briefs. And so this is another example of that commitment. It's important to know as we go through these slides what we mean by a weak developmental relationship level, moderate developmental relationship level, and strong developmental relationship level. And you can see there, we've essentially divided into 3 bands. Kids who self-assess the relationship at the bottom end of the scale, we called a weak developmental relationship. Kids in the middle, called moderate. Kids at the upper end of the distribution, we called a strong developmental relationship. And so you're going to see weak, moderate, strong as a way of slicing some of the data that we're now going to take a quick tour through. So let's get started in that. How did the young people in this 14,000 youth sample play out in terms of the strength of the developmental relationships that they experience? Really interestingly, in this sample, and this is a new improved measure of relationships from previous studies. If you remember the video that I showed a moment ago, in that video I said 1 in 5 kids, 20%, were identifying as not having developmental relationships in their lives. With a new robust measure and getting tighter about it, in this sample we came up with 10%. Now, we have to keep looking at using this measure in other contexts to probe what that number really is. But an interesting, and I guess in certain sense encouraging, finding of fewer kids not experiencing developmental relationships at all, or experiencing them in very weak ways than some of our previous studies had looked at. Again, we've improved our measures as our studies have progressed. The sample was pretty evenly split between other young people who are in that moderate level of a developmental relationship, and then 46% who are saying, yes, I really experience with staff in the school or the program this relationship as fully developmental. I get a lot of those 5 critical elements of a developmental relationship in my relationship with my teacher or the staff person in my out-of-school time program. So let's look at actually the 3 sectors that were in this study and just see how they compare to each other. You can see with schools, the relationship breakdown was 11% were weak, 48% are moderate, 41% were in that strong level. In the student support programs, we saw the profile looking quite different, at more of sort of a tiered structure, up to 61% of the kids experiencing really strong developmental relationships with staff in those programs, and then 70% in the out-of-school time setting. Now, as somebody who started his career as a classroom teacher at the high school level, you know, I look at this data, and in some ways it's disconcerting as you look at what schools are, students are saying about schools, and yet at the same time, in most cases, young people are choosing to participate in a student support program or an out-of-school time program, whereas they're required to be in school. So that's an important difference. And also we know that teachers and other staff in schools have got some important academic and other outcomes to meet that some kids might feel get in the way of relationships. So there's some reason to look at those numbers for the relationships, developmental relationships in schools differently than the other 2 categories. That said, I think as somebody who has worked in and for most of my career with schools, there's a story there that suggests that those of us who work in schools and work with kids in schools can do more to strengthen the relationships we build with kids, and that we might actually have some things to learn from our colleagues who work in student support programs, like, as I mentioned, city year or communities in schools, or out-of-school time programs that exist in most of the schools where we work. So there may be people in your school building after school who are connecting with some of your students in ways that it might be helpful for you to explore across that school out-of-school time divide. When we looked at the progression of kids' experience of developmental relationships from elementary school to middle school to high school, we also saw something interesting. At that elementary level, those 4th, 5th, and 6th graders in this sample were much more likely to have very, very strong developmental relationships with their teachers than were the middle school and high school. Now, to some extent, that's also developmentally normal. As kids get older, they get more independent. They're going to be less sort of inherently and instinctively positive about some of those adult relationships. And yet, as somebody who also worked at the high school level, and it's well known some of the challenges in the size and structure of the modern American high school, building relationships can get lost in the midst of a lot of other things. And so, again, there may be some inspiration and some resources that those of us at the secondary level might want to think about and take from our colleagues at the elementary level when it comes to relationship building, including some of the structures that exist. Being with one teacher for longer periods of time certainly affords some opportunities for relationship building that are not there when you have got 7 periods a day and you're moving through very large numbers of kids quickly. So interesting finding there in terms of the progression of relationships as kids age and grow. We also took a look here at how do the young people in this sample, in the aggregate, across all 14,000 of them, experience those 5 elements of a developmental relationship. And here's how it planned out. The one that they experienced most strongly at the highest levels, challenging growth. Second was providing support. Third, sharing power. Fourth, expressing care. And then the 5th was the expanding possibilities. Now, in this data, expressing care is actually usually number 1 or 2. And this is not a simplistic ranking in terms of comparing them to each other, because they were responding, the young people who took the survey were responding to each of these questions independent of the other elements. We didn't ask them, do you experience more challenge than you do caring? But this is an interesting finding, especially as we see the express care relative to some of the other elements of the framework somewhat lower than we've seen in other samples. So something for us to dig into as we begin to look more deeply at this data set. Certainly, as somebody who has done a lot of work on helping students aim for and succeed in post-secondary education who are from group backgrounds that are underrepresented in higher education, the expand possibilities data that we're looking at here, to me, really suggests a challenge and an opportunity that for kids to experience relationships with their teachers, with their program staff, that introduce them to new ways of seeing the world, to new ways of thinking, to new places, to new opportunities, is a real possibility for growth, because we've got a pretty large group of young people here saying, that's the thing, the element of a developmental relationship that I'm getting the least. Now, still, a lot of them are getting it at the moderate or strong level, but almost 1 in 5, 19%, are getting it weekly. And even that 38% at the moderate level, there could be some real productive targeting of expanding possibilities to move more of those kids from the moderate level to the strong level in expand possibilities. Interestingly, in this survey, we were able to actually look at not just the youth experience of the developmental relationships elements, but also the staff experience. So we also surveyed teachers and staff in these schools. And what we found across all 5 elements was an interesting discrepancy between how the youth saw the relationship and how the staff saw the relationship. Here you can see 85% of the staff said, I do high levels of expressing care in my relationship with the students I work with in my class, or the young people I work with in my group. But 63% of the young people reported expressing care. Sharing power, we saw the same discrepancy, 82% to 62%. Same with provide support. Same, though, a slightly narrower gap with challenging growth, and a big gap with the expanding possibilities. So one of the things we did in the webinar earlier today was actually ask people, using one of the little polls that you can do in the platform that we use, what might explain this? And we just gave a couple of different quick reasons to get people kind of thinking, why might this actually be the way it is? So we did a quick poll where we said, which of the following factors do you think is the most important, though not the only, explanation for the difference in how young people and adults view their relationships? And the options we gave people were A, like young people are just generally less enthusiastic about everything than adults, or young people and adults define actions like being caring differently, or I don't know, or another reason. And when we did that poll among the 1,000 people we had on the webinar today, here were their responses. Very few people thought yeah, the explanation is just that young people are a bit more cynical than adults. A lot of people agreed that there's a discrepancy potentially between the way adults define something like being caring and the young people define it. 15 people said they don't know, and then there was a mix of other reasons that we got in the chat box. One of the ones that I think was is worth noting was this idea that when people take a survey, which staff or teachers were the young people thinking of, and when the staff took the survey, which young people were they thinking of? And that's a really good question that sometimes we explore by doing interviews with people where we ask them to think aloud when we have them read a survey item. But you can see here the number one answer that people were thinking about was differences in the ways of interpreting the actions in a relationship. And this is a really important finding potentially if this gap exists in your school or program, because you may be working really, really hard to build relationships with kids, but if they are actually interpreting the work you're doing on behalf of relationships different from the way staff are intending it, the full benefits of the relationship may not be accruing to the young person. And so understanding as adults always, as much as we can, how young people are experiencing our relationships is a really, really critical priority. We would suggest it's something you can't do unless you have data of some kind, but you can explore it in other ways as well by continually trying to avoid what one organization I encountered a number of years ago calls adultism, continually assuming from the adult perspective that we can understand young people, their motivations, their desires, the things that they do. So the next piece of data that we looked at in the study were connections between developmental relationships and social emotional learning. Social emotional learning, of course, has taken off across the country, and we've got schools and increasingly out-of-school time programs really making SEL a major, major priority for the work that they do with young people. And so we wanted to explore connections between developmental relationships and SEL. And in particular, the question for us at the outset of this project was, well, how are we going to define and measure SEL? And so we reached out to the organization that really has led and in some ways arguably helped create the field of SEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, CASEL. And we asked CASEL if we could build measures of the 5 elements of their SEL framework. And they agreed. And so while they don't endorse any particular measures, ours or anybody's, they did approve the development of these measures, which happened through careful research and analysis of the data and validation of the measures. So let me show you what we found. When we looked at the CASEL framework, which is comprised of 5 key social emotional competencies: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills, we saw, first of all, a really pretty striking distribution of different self-evaluation by the 14,000 young people we surveyed of their own social emotional competencies. The first bar shows a brief measure combining all 5 elements of the CASEL framework, and there you can see about 50% of the young people said they mostly demonstrate those competencies. Another 45% said they somewhat. We would consider that definitely area for improvement. 5% said, I really do this very little. Interestingly, there were no young people who came out in the extremely at the top level when we combined all 5 competencies. And then if you look at each of the CASEL competencies below, you can see the range of responses for how young people assessed their own social awareness, self-management, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills. If you combine mostly and extremely, you can see, as has been the case with many SEL measures, a lot of kids feel pretty good about their own SEL competencies. But interestingly here, compared to some other measures that I've seen, we don't have the same problem of what often gets called ceiling effect, which is that everybody's so high, they self-assess themselves so high, there's nowhere to go. Here, we're just seeing social awareness, 8% of the kids at the top of the range, 2% in self-management, 11% in self-awareness, 6% in responsible decision-making, and 3% in relationship skills. And so there is a place for the largest distribution, which is in the mostly category, to go in strengthening social awareness and self-awareness and relationship skills in order to increase the number of students who feel really, really good about their competencies in those areas. So that was a quick summary of the breakdown of how in this 14,000 young person sample that we are talking about, those young people self-assessed their own social emotional competencies as articulated by Castle's framework for SEL. So we wanted also to look, though, between not just at kids' evaluation of their social emotional competencies, but at connections between developmental relationships and those competencies. And what we found here was very encouraging to us. We found that there were statistically significant associations between kids' experience of developmental relationships as measured by the Search Institute framework and social emotional learning as measured by the Castle framework. So you can see in the stacked bar charts here that the more young people experienced strong developmental relationships or moderate developmental relationships, the more they were likely to report that they had strong self-awareness or responsible decision-making and social awareness. Now, it's important to state, as I'm sure many of you know, that correlation is not causation, that just because in this instance, relationships and social emotional competencies move in the same direction, that one doesn't necessarily cause the other. And yet, it is important to investigate those associations, because when those two factors move in the same direction, it may indicate that there could be a causal relationship at work here. And our future research will build on this very early finding to explore that possible causal relationships. That is to say, when we strengthen the relationships, when we make relationships more developmental, does it strengthen young people's social emotional learning competencies? And this research is an encouraging step on that long-term journey that will ultimately include random experimental trials, the kind of research that they often do in economics or in medicine, where you have a control group that you don't mess with and nothing happens, and a treatment group, a group that is randomly assigned, in our case, to use some relationship building tools or be in organizations using the development relationships framework, and see if in fact those who get the treatment do better, make more progress than those who do not. So that's a long-term vision where we're headed, and this is an important finding on the road to that destination. We also looked in this same study at a measure that we have built of academic motivation that really speaks to young people's intrinsic desire to learn, to work hard in school, to keep going when they fail, to learn from their mistakes. And here again, we saw significant correlations between the young people's experience of developmental relationships and the degree to which they are motivated to learn. Does the relationship cause the motivation? We don't know yet that we can say that with any level of confidence, but there's a lot of reason to think that there is an influence there, that schools and programs that seek to increase things like motivation could emphasize if they integrate developmental relationships explicitly into the work that they do with young people. So the next thing that we looked at in this sample were connections between developmental relationships and what we call equity. The kids' experience within a school and program of equity, and also whether that school or program prepared the young person to advance and experience equity in the world. And in equity, we really saw it as two sides of a coin. One, does the school or program affirm racial, cultural, and other forms of difference? Are they responsive? Are they competent in that space? The second, other half of it, does the young person experience bias or discrimination? And an equitable environment in the work that we are doing suggests that it's not an either or, it's a both and, that you're affirming and responsive, and you're working to reduce, or ideally you have eliminated, discrimination and bias. So let's take a look at what we found in the connection between developmental relationships and equity in schools and youth programs. First, just what did we learn about equity? Well, here's some very specific ways that we defined an equitable environment in a school or out-of-school time program or student support organization. Rules are enforced fairly, all people are treated fairly, youth are encouraged to get to know others with different cultures and backgrounds, the staff actually considers cultural, racial needs, you learn how to work with people from different backgrounds, you're encouraged to positively share your own cultural background. So those were the descriptors. Here's what we learned about how young people in the schools and programs that participated in the study are or are not experiencing those actions of an equitable environment. You can see the one that they experience the most often is fairness, that rules are enforced fairly, though there were 9% of the youth who said, yeah, that's just a little bit true. At the other end of the continuum, you saw that the one that was happening the least often was the being encouraged to share your culture, your background, and also learning how to work with people from different backgrounds. It's definitely happening in many instances, but there's a fairly large group of young people, at least in this sample, who are not suggesting that that is something that happens frequently for them in their schools or programs. Interestingly, when we asked young people in this study if they have experienced discrimination or bias from a staff member in their school or program, a pretty small percentage said that they had, 5%. And at a time when we're thinking a lot about adult attitudes around equity, around SEL, around youth voice, I think this is an interesting finding that we'll have to explore further. It's a relatively small number of kids who are saying, yes, I've experienced discrimination or bias from a teacher, from a staff member in my program. However, we also asked about other kids, peer-to-peer interactions, and fully 1 in 5 youth reported experiencing discrimination or bias from their peers. So we also went a bit deeper. We said, well, what do you mean by discrimination or bias? We talked, as we looked at the different types of discrimination or bias, we looked at race, we looked at gender, we looked at sexual orientation, and there was a mix of other reasons that were also there. And you can see here, again, a gap between experiencing discrimination or bias from their peers more often than teachers or program staff in looking at this sample. In the study, we identified a number of actions that that indicate discrimination or indicate bias. And those you can see there ranging from feeling actually threatened or harassed down to or out to making false assumptions about the young person. And here's how that played out. About 10% of the kids really are experiencing threatening and harassing environments in this sample. But more than 1/3 of the kids are experiencing people making false assumptions about them tied to their race, tied to their gender, tied to their sexual orientation. And you can see a range of young people who are experiencing those other forms of bias or discrimination in their school or in their program. 27% of them saying, I feel like I get less respect than other people because of that difference. In this case, tied to race or ethnicity. So when we looked at the connections between equity and how kids experience equity or don't experience equity in a school or program, we also wanted to think beyond the school or program. We wanted to think about our schools and programs preparing young people essentially to live with equity in the world. And so we hypothesized, based on our review of the research, a number of what we called equitable actions. And those involved engaging in critical reflection. Why is the situation like this way, like this? Why is the world like this? Explicitly teaching about equity and inequities. Where do they exist? Why do they exist? How can they be overcome? And then also more broadly, efforts to create a safe and just space, one in which people feel safe and affirmed. When we asked about how young people experience those equitable actions, here's what we found. In all three, there was a relatively small group of youth who said, yes, this is a top priority for the school or program I'm in. It happens a lot. I really notice it. About 1/3 were in that mostly level, which means it's happening quite a lot. It's happening fairly frequently. You can see a lot of young people feel, 46%, that their schools and programs are safe and just spaces. But also, if you look at the somewhat and a little category, were a school or program really to want to lean into equity in the work that they're doing with young people, there's a lot of room for growth that you can see there. 24%, for instance, of the young people saying, yeah, just a little bit of engaging in critical reflection, and another 38% saying somewhat. So when you combine that, there's a real opportunity there with more than half the youth to strengthen their experience of critical reflection as part of a broader equity agenda that a school or program might adopt. So what about connections between those equitable environments and SEL? We also looked at that in the sample. And similar to what we saw in the analysis of developmental relationships and SEL, there's a statistically significant correlation between the experience of schools and programs that promote equitable environments and the mastery of social and emotional competencies by the young people. These are not huge associations, but they're statistically significant, which means we can be quite confident they're not happening due to chance. If the kids took the survey again the next day, we would see something very close to this not a radical shift just because of the number of kids was so small or something like that. So we saw an association between equitable environments and SEL. We also saw an association between engaging in critical reflection and student mastery of SEL, and between teaching about equity and SEL. And finally, between creating safe and just places and SEL. So again, correlation is not causation, but the association suggests the possibility that when schools and programs embrace equity in the ways that we've just discussed, it might contribute to student mastery of critical social emotional competencies like relationship skills, responsible decision-making, self-awareness, self-management, and social awareness. The reason that I wanted to highlight in this webinar these connections between developmental relationships and SEL and equity and SEL is because increasingly I am seeing thought leaders and hearing from practitioners the desire to do what sometimes is called systemic SEL. And what we really mean by that systemic SEL label is it's not a separate program. It's not just something we do in advisory. It's not just something we do when we use one particular curriculum. It's baked into everything that we do. There was a recent article by Josh Starr, former superintendent, in the Kaplan magazine, and I pulled out this quote because I really think it captures this core idea. He wrote, "It's a mistake to think of SEL as a discrete program that we give to certain populations of students. SEL is not trauma-informed care and doesn't take the place of mental health services. It's not something you do for 45 minutes on Thursdays and then return to regular programming. And it's not something that we do for children alone without also attending to the social and emotional lives of the adults who work in our schools. Rather, SEL must be woven into all the interactions within a school community." So when I listen to Dr. Starr make that point, or when I hear other people make a similar point, we don't want to just do a packaged program for 45 minutes. Of course, I agree, but then I think back to my days, for instance, as a school and district administrator, and I say, well, how would you do that? Like, how do you integrate SEL into everything that you do? How do you integrate something like relationship skills or responsible decision-making into everything that you do? And I think one thing that this data set that we've been talking about here today suggests might be the case is that if you really want to bake SEL, developing young people's SEL, into everything you do, there's two levers that might be really powerful for you to push. And one is building developmental relationships, and the other is creating equitable environments. I tried to put it all together using this very, very slick, fancy, smart art that you can find in PowerPoint. You can see there that the data that we've just gone through really suggests that developmental relationships are associated with students' social emotional learning competencies in statistically significant ways, in important ways. Same thing for equitable environments and student SEL. What was really interesting is when we did a regression analysis and we actually looked at this 14,000 youth data set, what we found was that while developmental relationships seem to influence the experience of developmental relationships, influences the mastery of social emotional learning competencies, and equitable environments influence the mastery of social emotional learning competencies. When young people experienced both of those things, when they experienced developmental relationships and equity, there was a significant interaction effect that meant that the SEL competencies were even higher when both of those were in place in a school and in a program. And so if we're thinking about creating schools and programs that are truly relationship rich and that are truly grounded in equity, the exciting thing is those also might be the places where young people's social emotional competencies are developed in the most powerful possible ways. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a place for 45-minute programs that explicitly teach SEL skills and competencies, but that if you want to create an environment in which that program or that advisory period or whatever it is you're doing is going to be really reinforced and really built upon throughout everything that young people experience, an investment in both development relationships and equity might be a really practical, not easy, but practical way to do it. So if I were you, I might be at this point in a webinar like this saying, okay, I get the theory, where do I start? Because this is not quick plug and play, just press start work, and you click your fingers and it's done. It's long-term work, and it's hearts and minds work. So the question then we posed to the participants in the webinar we had earlier today was this: where would you start? Which of the following initiatives do you think should be a top priority for the organization where you work? We gave them 3 choices. It was a horrible forced choice. We said you can choose strengthening development relationships, you can choose advancing equity, or you can choose developing SEL competencies through structured programs. And here's what participants said. 48% of them said developmental relationships, 30% said advancing equity, and 20% said developing SEL competencies. And of course, kind of the whole theory here is that you don't have to choose between those 2, and that maybe you shouldn't, that you should be, amidst everything else you've got to do, trying to integrate all 3 into the work that you're doing with young people. At this point in the webinar, I gave people a chance to ask questions, and there were 3 in particular that came through the chat that I want to just briefly summarize here, because I think they will be of continuing interest to anybody else who logs on to watch this. The first was a general question about, well, how can you use developmental relationships data? What's it useful for? What's it good for? It's a long answer, but I think that I would highlight really 2 particular things. One, seeming kind of obvious, but we think really, really powerful. And the first is developmental relationships data can help you elevate the importance and the role of relationships in your organization. The work that we've done over the past 6 years on developmental relationships has really found that pretty much everybody who gets into education and youth development understands the power of relationships. We experienced it kind of as I tried to illustrate with the brief exercise at the beginning of this session, asking you to think about the role of relationships in your own life. We've experienced it in our own lives. We've experienced it as teachers, as youth workers. But in organization after organization, despite the experience that all of us have had with relationships, and frankly, despite the powerful body of research that attests to the importance of relationships, relationships somehow slip down the priority list. They get overtaken by the accountability work, the quality of the curriculum, fidelity to the program, dealing with the huge crises that exist in the lives of many young people and families today. And so that relationship that is so central never becomes central to the organization that is working to improve youth outcomes. And so when you have data on relationships, you actually have a way to make visible who is and who isn't experienced relationships. You might see in your program that you have, if you remember, 10% of those kids in the aggregate sample we looked at in this session were experiencing weak levels of relationships. Maybe it's 20% in your program, maybe it's 10, and that you would actually begin to be able to look at who aren't we reaching, who are we not reaching. Or maybe the issue is not so much that in your school or program, there's some kids who aren't experiencing developmental relationships at all. Maybe it's actually that they're not experiencing certain elements of the developmental relationships framework. We worked several years ago with a wonderful national organization that works around the country on high school completion and progress to post-secondary education. They work at elementary, middle, and high school levels. And as we looked at data on the work that they do with young people, we found that they are masters of expressing care and providing support. That's baked into their program model, and it's baked into the people they hire, and it's baked into their culture. But they were much less attentive to challenging growth, sharing power, and expanding possibilities. And when we probed that, one reason was the kids that are served by this organization face so many challenges that the staff, frankly, didn't want to push them too much because they were kind of like a safe harbor in their lives. But as we talked more over a multi-year project with leaders and practitioners that are in that organization, we said that may be a missed opportunity, precisely because these staff are so good at expressing care and providing support. They have an opportunity to challenge growth and share power and expand possibilities that could be really, really powerful because they have that core connection based on caring and support. And that when you want to create truly developmental relationships, activating those other elements of the framework, like challenging growth, is very beneficial for youth development and for success. So that's one reason. The other thing is, if you have data on something like this, you can change the structure. You can realize, oh my gosh, we need more time, or we need more time with these kids. You can decide we need to invest in more professional development. You could decide we need to take a new approach to family engagement, for instance. A lot of other changes in the structure, culture, and processes of organizations can be informed by having data on how kids are experiencing relationships. The last thing I said in response to this question about what is developmental relationships data good for is that it also can help you understand other pieces of your data universe, other priorities for your organization. Some schools that we've worked with have said, we want to understand the relationships that kids who get into discipline trouble are experiencing, or the relationships that kids who are not succeeding academically, as measured by grades or standardized tests, are having. And it gives you an additional insight, an additional input to the relationships that kids are not experiencing, tied to some of those other outcomes, such that if kids are not performing well, for instance, in reading, if you're a school or a program that's focused on reading, understanding the relational experience that those kids are having with your staff could be part of what you need to improve, rather than changing your curriculum or changing your program model. It might be the relationship piece that is not quite getting you where you need to go. So broad thoughts on what developmental relationships data is good for. And those were some of the themes that I hit in responding to that earlier today. A second question was about self-report measures. The question was a very thoughtful one about measurement. And they said, increasingly, people are struggling with using surveys, self-report, of the kind that we have been talking about in this session, to assess social emotional competencies, like we looked at in the Castle framework, social awareness, for instance, or responsible decision-making. And the hesitation there is that when you're self-assessing, you may just really be delusional. You're born on third base and think you hit a triple or something. You just aren't self-aware. Or maybe you really do know where you are, but you put a different, check a different box on the survey because of what sometimes we call social desirability bias. Either I'm telling you, teacher, program staff, what I think you want to hear, or I'm telling myself what I wish was true. Now, in the work we do and in the work others do, you can address a lot of that through how you design the survey, how you write the measure. You try and get it so it doesn't feel like there's an incentive to fudge it, that it's a very neutral question. But that is a problem. It is a problem of SEL assessment through self-assessment that we think a lot about and that the field thinks a lot about. The thing that I think is super important is not all of those concerns, and in fact, many of them either don't apply or are much less problematic when the focus is on relationships. And that's because the self-assessment of your relationship is in itself very important, even if it might not be completely right. If you remember back to the difference we saw in how young people and their teachers or their program staff saw the relationships, I've been in sessions with teachers when we showed them data like that, and I'll never forget there was one teacher, it was in Oregon, and he actually got kind of upset about looking at how his students in his high school evaluated the express care that they got from their teachers. And he said, damn it, we care about these kids even if they don't know it. And I remember vividly, and this is quite a few years ago, there was just a pause, because for all of us in this sort of data-driven decision-making session that this took place in, we realized, well, even if you are, as I'm quite sure that teacher and who was the football coach was, you're working super hard to express care for kids. If the kids are not interpreting that or not aware of that as expressing care, if maybe you're not making it explicit, using words like, I really care about you, the young person may not be actually capturing that. And so when it comes to relationships, perception really is a part of reality, a fundamental part of reality. And so that's one reason why we find that both in terms of those relationship measures and the equitable environment measures, what you want to capture is people's perspective. Problematic as that perspective might be for you as the practitioner or the leader in the school or the program. And that is a bit different than asking people to self-assess some of their SEL competencies, though we're also very, very enthused about the SEL measures that are in this data set. And then the third and final question that I got during the webinar was about measuring change. Could you use the developmental relationship survey as a measure of change? And the short answer is yes, it was designed for that. We have every reason to believe that these are good measures of change. We know they're stable over time, that when we gave them in what's called test-retest, that they measure the same thing over time. And so we're quite confident about the psychometric validity of the measures. That said, there is a practical challenge in measuring change in relationships, because relationships themselves change, and they should change. And they change sometimes in ways that seem counterintuitive and that might actually influence the data that you get. Let me give you an example. If at the beginning of a school year, a student was going through a crisis at home and her teacher was aware of that and was very supportive and engaged and reaching out, and then you gave one of our surveys at the beginning of the school year, you might have that student rate her teacher very, very highly on the expressing care items, because it's happening and that teacher's doing it, and the young person is experiencing it, and it shows up on the survey. Fast forward 9 months later to the end of the year, again, in this hypothetical situation, imagine that the crisis that was a big issue at home in September has now been resolved. And so by April or May, that young person is not needing or wanting the same level of caring and support that they were getting from their teacher. And the teacher, being a good practitioner, a good relationship builder, responds accordingly and is less directly and intensively engaged. If you gave the same survey in the post-test in the spring, that young person might, again, accurately evaluate the caring, express care items on that survey toward the lower end of the distribution. Step back and look at the data. In this hypothetical example of what we call an N of one person, it might look on the surface of it like expressing care got much worse over the course of the school year, that it was really good at the beginning and then by the end it was really low, when in fact it was really high at the beginning because it needed to be and the teacher was responding accordingly. It didn't need to be as much at the other end of the spectrum. And so that's why we say that when you look at these data longitudinally at multiple points over time, and of course you wouldn't be looking at just one kid in a data set on your school or your program or your group, keeping in mind the complexity of relationships. We think it would be terrible if anybody started to use relationship data, especially self-assessment relationship data, for accountability purposes, for a way to sort of rank schools and programs or something like that. But it's invaluable data to improve. It's invaluable data to help you get a sense of not just what you hope kids are experiencing in the relationships you work to build with them, but what they actually are experiencing. And when you put those two together, that's where you have kind of the big picture for how things are working. So if you're interested in more information on the Developmental Relationships Survey, there is more information available on the Search Institute website. You can see the address there. I hope that people who are interested will go and check it out and ask us questions, and we can probe things further. And I want to just end by coming back to that metaphor that was in the video that we watched at the beginning of this session, that relationships really are the roots of youth development. And that when you take time to build those relationships with young people, then you are actually helping them put down those roots, the roots that are short and small if they're in your school or your program for a short period of time, or that are long and that are deep, like the roots that you build within a family or a program where kids participate year after year. So thank you for this fast investigation with me into this new data set. More analysis, more thinking, more tools, more resources will be forthcoming, but I'm really honored to have had the chance to take a moment with you to consider this today. And so to be continued on many fronts. We are always around for questions, for observations, for comments in our work at Search Institute. And we thank you for joining us for this redone version of our Trifecta webinar from earlier today. Thanks again. Best wishes for navigating the huge challenges of the current school and program year that is unfolding all around us.